live stream the meeting.
There we go.
So we should be able to give that to all people connected. Hello, lovely audience. Thank you for being here on time. What we'll do is we'll start, as we normally do, just 5 minutes after the announced time, just to give those people who are a little bit tardy 5 minutes to get into the meeting. If you're here, you've got 5 minutes to live stream the meeting. Oh, hold on. We should be able to. And I'm going to copy the link. And I'm going to paste the link into the chat here. Yeah. So that's the link to the live stream, should anybody need it.
Okay.
Yes, we had to make a radical decision at the end of last week that the software we're using was struggling with meetings above a certain number. So we moved it onto Zoom and YouTube for those people who are less keen on Zoom. And in the spirit of the art program, we are learning together as a cohort. My speaker, Gordon Cheung, myself, and all you wonderful people. And if issues arise, we will solve them on the hoof and be flexible and creative in our solutions. Yes, Mita, we are recording. I will press record as soon as we start properly. Thanks for reminding me. Or actually, would you mind doing that, Mita? Is that all right? If you could record it, that'd be great. Just press. You're a co-host now, so it should be possible for you to do that.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that.
Thank you. So we've got people diving in now thick and fast. Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting about 5 minutes.
I should have the, just in case, drop signal again. I can get back in.
I mean, if the worst comes to the worst, I've got your phone number, so I could just phone you and we could sort it out that way. I've got so many possible routes through because I every eventuality we've accounted for.
Great.
Well, that's a funny thing is as you sort of learn the materiality of the new space, I guess, is you learn the issues as well as the advantages.
Mm.
I mean, for me, one of the exciting things about the Zoom lecture is, as I discussed earlier with you, is the idea that our audience is much more keen on getting involved. They will start asking questions almost straight away, and it sort of gives us a less scary mode of asking questions. So it means that everyone feels they can sort of dive in and just ask a question as it goes along. They don't have to stop or raise their hand or anything, just sort of throw it in the chat, and then as it's appropriate, we bring them in.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Right.
So what, they will chat, they'll write their questions into the chat?
Just write their questions into the chat. We've got Mita helping out today, and Mita will collect the questions and throw them at us if we've missed any of them, but hopefully that won't be necessary. Well, so actually, at the moment, Nita, I'm allowing people to join. But now that you are a co-host, it should be possible for you to do that as well. And beyond a certain point, if you could be admitting them, if you just press down at the bottom on participants, you should see them on the right-hand side. Just admit them, and then it's once I start talking to Gordon, I don't want to miss out people and have them languishing in the waiting room for hours.
No worries, I'm on it.
So when was the last time you did this artist talk? And how much do they change week to week? Or event to event?
I think I did, the last one I did was maybe the Glasgow School of Art, but that was like in January,
Right.
I think. And so it was just obviously before the lockdown, loomed.
Yeah.
And it was during my solo exhibition in London as well. Luckily, that only got affected at the very end of the whole from lockdown. And so yeah, no, the talk varies not that much, I guess. But it depends on, like, obviously what where I'm speaking and about what in general. So but clearly, this one will be involving issues to do with COVID and also the different global responses, and particularly how it affects my I suppose Asian descent. So it's been definitely an interesting year,
Yes.
tumultuous for many reasons,
Oh, absolutely.
I think surrealism has died. It's just we're living in a sci-fi world, and it's a rubbish one at that.
Well,
and I like sci-fi. So
I was thinking about that. Surrealism may have died. I think you're right about that. But magic has not died. Magic is well and truly alive, and so is mysticism. But it's a sort of, I'm reading it as a sort of not a retreat from reality or a sort of head in the sand, avoiding the political realm, but rather a sort of way of creating new forms of knowledge that don't depend on a sort of Eurocentric patriarchal model, that sort of invoking the magical or the mystical has a way of sort of somehow circumventing these modes of knowledge in some way. But maybe that's me being very, very hopeful. I told you I was hopeful today. I'm feeling jolly. I don't know why.
I think it's great. We need this. It's an antidote. To a year of strangeness. So, the most powerful man in the world tweeting away these crazy, all-consuming, attention-seeking, statements, of ridiculousness. So it's been and then compound that with the pandemic itself as well, and you just got this, like, what is going on? So I think it's great. I think it is great that we were just talking about the way how the art community has come together through Artist Support Pledge and so on. And it's shown that there's an enormous amount of generosity, within our community, in coming together to support each other.
And actually, that's a good moment. In that positive statement, I'm going to start the recording. We're now recording the session, everyone. And if you're all right, Gordon, should we get started?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Great. Well, oops. No, so I didn't even warn you. I don't really do intros, Gordon, because I feel that I don't want to tread all over your talk, other than to say that you're an internationally acclaimed, fantastic painter. Actually, no, I'm not even going to call you painter. That's just a silly thing to call you. Artist that works predominantly with paint, but not exclusively. And we had a chat earlier this week, and we decided that we would have a fairly conversational approach to the talk today. So I want to encourage our audience to, as juicy topics come up, to ask away, ask questions, throw some provocations, make it exciting for us, and we'll do our best to respond. The session will end at 7 o'clock, as it always does, and it's great to have you all here. Gordon, without any further ado, over to you.
Sure. I mean, if you'd like to run the, I suppose, slides in the background, I guess, or the PDF, that'd be great. But I mean, the talk starts, or the images start with my student work, because I thought that would be a good place. That's not the beginning of the document, but
I'll get you back to the beginning in a second, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so 94 to 98, I was at Central St. Martin's, and the first thing I did when I got onto the course was to decide to paint without paint. And the idea being that by removing paint from my practice, I would question the identity of painting itself, you know, from a kind of, I suppose, philosophical point of view. And so how I did this was to substitute paint for collage, and I would use the maps and the stock listings of the Financial Times to create what I felt was a reflection and a way of capturing the communications and digital revolution that was happening at the time. And that was the availability of mobile phones and the internet. And there was this utopic euphoria about borders and boundaries going to be dissolving. And I would use these technological processes such as the color photocopying machine in the library. And I would scan images, and while it was being scanned, sort of rotate the image to create these kind of simulated brushstrokes. And in that way, I was creating a virtual painting or a simulated painting. And it was a way for me to sidestep the dominant narrative at the time of painting for painting's sake, because I really wanted to say something about what I felt was happening in the world. You know, all these revolutions, technological revolutions at the threshold of the new millennium and so on. So that utopic euphoria eventually crashed into the millennium bug. And this was this fear that computers were literally going to explode in front of our faces and airplanes were going to drop out of the sky. And I thought that this kind of fear was quite fascinating, which then led on to 2001, more recorded disasters than at any other time, and the collapse of the first two big-to-fail companies, Enron and WorldCom. And then this was eclipsed by 9/11 and the Twin Tower attacks, and ensuing war on terror by George W. Bush, and the invasion of Iraq, the illegal invasion of Iraq, and even though there was no justification in respect to it being anything to do with 9/11. And so these works that you're seeing right now came about. I moved away from abstraction into figuration after doing a residency in Pakistan, and it led me to using a lot more processes and techniques and layering it into the works to try and create a language that I felt could adapt and be used to talk about what I felt were wider issues. And
can I ask a question about these works?
Sure. Yeah.
One of the things that really intrigues me is that, and you often see it, is that painting is kept on hold, or just kept. The painterly is there's a need to restrain it in some way. So in your earlier works, you discussed those in terms of rejecting painting for painting's sake, and yet when painting comes back into the work, the painterly is very apparent in the work. Was there a sort of a longing for the paint as you come back to it, or was the coming back to it a new way of thinking about that in a sense?
Yeah, I think when I denied paint in painting, it forced me to obviously find a new language, and having I found it, I gave myself permission to go back to using paint. But even then, there was these kind of unorthodox approach to its use, such as spraying it, or in more recent years, maybe in the last 10 years, sort of painting onto plastic and peeling it off and then collaging it on. So it's kind of like this sort of unusual way of painting. And the reason for it is that it's to create these kind of deconstructive spaces. Or what I mean by that is that I hope to create a curious surface through which you try to investigate how it's done. And this questioning, this space of questioning, then wraps through, if you like, into also the narratives that are in the work as well. So the language itself tries to create a space in which it is a meditative one, or one in which you're invited to deconstruct, the materiality, the techniques, the processes, and then by extension also the narratives that are in the works. So, for example, some of the early works, one of the first ones, which was of shredded lychee cans, it was made during 1997, which was the handover of Hong Kong back to China. I didn't understand what that really meant, to be honest. I didn't even understand what it meant for Hong Kong to be a colony as well. It was only much later on did I come to realize how that came to be, through the forcing of opium to be purchased by China, and then turning Britain into the first narco state. And they semi-colonized China and then forced them to buy more opium, and then forcing eventually them into what's called the 100 Years of Humiliation, and also to give Hong Kong to the British as well. These are sorts of histories and narratives that I'm very interested in, and I try to create this unorthodox language in order to provide a place to be able to question what I feel are fixed histories, or rather histories written by victors, to look at it from alternative points of views, different dimensions, to open the mind to see it from a multi-perspectival sort of point of view, rather than one in which you have simply been given in your education, in soft power culture, or just outright propaganda. Because I never really learned much about China at school. It wasn't really a subject that was particularly covered, and certainly the British Empire and its darker aspects of colonization, slavery, and militarized trade routes wasn't particularly something that was explored, in my education.
And that's key, isn't it? Because it's on two fronts. First of all, just that by ignoring certain bits of history, you're actually perpetrating a new version of history. And secondly, that actually, even when it is taught, it's taught in a very particular, partial way that very much skews our perspective on it. Do you think that, or to what extent do you think that art provides a space to educate, or to fill in the gaps, if you like? Or is it a different sort of space?
Oh, well, art can be. I mean, art has so many functions, right? In civilization, and it's changed so much as well. I mean, it's a form of soft power, as well as a form of.
Could you elaborate that in relation to that term, soft power, just for our audience?
So the first time I came across this idea was when I was a student at St. Martin's. I was interested in abstract expressionism, and I kept thinking, this kind of looks a little bit like Chinese calligraphy, or certainly the mentality of it as well. But that's by the by. It's as I learned more and more, I learned that through Robert Hughes, an Australian critic, and he had a TV series, and he called abstract expressionism a cultural weapon. and that really like got my interest, up, and then I started learning about because America is unusual in that there's something called the Freedom of Information Act, and it allows them to get these sorts of documents to, the people can access these documents. And so there was a CIA operation called Operation Long Leash, and it was the funding of the abstract expressionist movement. And it involved, I believe, it was Rockefeller, I think. I can't remember exactly. But he went around buying a whole load of like abstract expressionists and so on. Even the abstract expressionists were like going, it's probably the CIA. They were kind of joking about it. But de Kooning was the de facto leader of this movement. But America decided to choose Jackson Pollock, because he is a pure American-born person, whereas de Kooning is an immigrant. And it was used as a so-called cultural weapon against the USSR, the Cold War. It was a Cold War soft power campaign. And so that sort of opened my eyes to thinking about most art as being a form of soft power. So, for example, the sublime is, to me, a form of propaganda. I mean, if we think about the American sublime painters, for example, that I saw at Tate in the Tate one year, a group exhibition, there's very little depiction of American Indians, or Native Americans, in those paintings. It's always of these kind of virgin territories, a beautiful landscape, awe-inspiring. And then the little figure that's often in them is obviously of a white guy, a explorer, a discoverer, and this overwhelming sense of nature is being divinely given to this person, that is rightfully theirs, that God is in the power of nature, and that he has given it to this person that's overlooking this vast terrain. I mean, that's a form of propaganda. It's it means that you've been given the God-given right to conquer that land. That it is all yours for the taking, including all its resources. So that's what I mean by art as a form of soft power. So.
I mean, I guess in that I'm interested in the agency of the artist in that, because undoubtedly there are the sublime, say, in relation to the romantics, has a very particular set of politics around it that in many ways are deeply problematic. But whether artists are entirely complicit in using the power or not, I think starts to become intriguing.
Yes,
perhaps they are.
Yes, no, absolutely. That's why you romanticize the language.
Yeah.
That's why and that's what some of my works to do with glitching the photographs of high resolution images of paintings from the Rijksmuseum is kind of about. It's a questioning of fixed points of histories, and to disguise the darker aspects of how they have accrued their wealth. So, for example, the still life paintings, they're often romanticized as the futility of materialism and the fragility of mortality. There's these beautiful poetic sort of like philosophical sort of ideas. Yet, of course, the genre itself includes the depiction, and this is a Protestant sort of society, so they're not meant to be showing and being so showy and so on, yeah. But the Dutch Golden Age 370 years ago was the birth of modern capitalism and the rise of the merchant classes. So many of them wanted to find a way to show off their wealth and how they've accrued it through these militarized trade routes, colonization and slavery. But you're not going to see any of that, in the paintings, but you will see these fantastic objects and these glittering, exotic flowers and foods that are from different parts of the world, etc., and so on. And but you're not going to see the darker aspects of how that civilization has actually amassed that wealth. You're not going to see all of the slaves, that perhaps their house, has been involved with, or the industries through which was reliant on slaves, or the colonization of countries, nations, and the subjugation, that is involved, and that is violence on a state mass level, and you have to be very organized to achieve that. And so you're not going to want to really, include that in art. Because art is meant to be this elevated symbol of, you know, the greatness of your society and civilization, and its power. And by, having art, especially if you're going to commission it and so on, by a great artist, then some of that, social status and wealth and power is centralized, if you like, into these objects, and helps to increase your stature as well.
It's vital that we sort of interrogate and ask questions of the work we're making, the work others are making, the work that has been made. And I think that not to be scared that things can coexist, that something can be about the fragility of life at the same time as being about something really problematic, and sort of, and
Yeah.
finding that, and not and being willing to speak it, being willing to see it is absolutely vital.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't want to, because we're so inured, into even not wanting to discuss, politics, for example.
Yeah.
It becomes like a dirty word, and but I find it really important because it's part of our human experience, and it's about looking at who we are in order to understand how we want to be, and only by seeing, the sides of, you know, all sides of the great civilizations that we may well be existing in, only then can we really, improve and make, a better world, and also humanity. It's
So,
such an important aspect.
if we return then to these paintings that we're looking at the moment, the Four Horsemen, for example, is that all right? We come to these. It's really interesting to think about the way the politics reveals itself in these works, a sort of an interest in Americana, an interest in American history in all its problematic facets, but also a sort of a still from a yet to be filmed science fiction movie, or the dream of of a kid that wants to be a cowboy. It holds all those things. How do you think those, the narrative, the politics, the fact, the fiction, all sort of correspond within it?
Well, narratives are incredibly powerful tools, if you like. They can unite people into a belief, into a group, into a tribe, into a society, into a civilization, and also a nation. So narratives are extremely powerful stories, that can bind us all together. So those are the things that I am very, very interested in capturing in my work, which is why I look towards the past as well as, into the present and the future. And so science fiction, is an extrapolation of our present reality into an imagined future, which can be a really important sort of space for us to project into, to imagine what society and civilization that we want. And quite often, science fictions are kind of dystopic, in order to, I suppose, highlight what we don't want. And also terror and fear is way more powerful as a way of making us sit up and pay attention to something. We are biologically determined, to pay more attention to, in a way, negative news than positive, and because our survival might actually rely on it. And so it becomes these kind of narratives can become extremely powerful ways of not only entertaining us, but also making us think about our current realities.
It's also a system of ordering, isn't it? A narrative is a way of making sense of something as much as anything, and that can be a personal narrative or a group narrative or a national narrative, or they can function on many levels, can't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, what about because working within this field, there's a sort of sense of real responsibility to the discourses that you're invoking, and yet I think that one of the freedoms that's given to artists is the ability to prey on other disciplines and extract facts and bits from other disciplines and sort of reconfigure them into a new discipline, if you like, within artist practice. How does one do that when you're dealing with things that are as urgent and painful and difficult as narratives of oppression, of empire, of
Do you mean like how do you respond fast enough, or how do you respond to something within a reasonable timeline to express,
I meant more that do you feel you have to be factually accurate? Do you feel you can play with it? Can the image flip? Can it do, or to what extent are you so?
Okay, so with my recent body of work, which is I suppose to do with the geopolitics of around China, a lot of my interest was in, I guess, trying to understand what the rise of China actually meant as well. And that meant looking at the facts of what they have developed and how they have developed. So it's extremely important to be as factual as I can with what they have achieved. Because being in the West, there is a lot of anxiety, if you like, in respect to the West's relationship to China. And often it's negative because it comes down to a rather simplified good versus evil or democracy versus communism. And obviously communism has been absolutely hammered, as an ideology in the West, as something that is belonging to an evil empire. And so I wanted to look past that and actually look at the projects that have been achieved. So, for example, more high-speed railway built than the entire world history. The largest human project in history, One Belt, One Road, which is over 150 nations are going to form trade links with China. And 850 million people lifted out of poverty. And in a matter of decades. This is extraordinary, and of course there are problems, there are humanitarian issues and so on. But if you're going to look at the negative aspects in that way, then please self-reflect upon democratic civilizations as well, and what they have done. So are we to assume that, for example, the military might of America dropping all these bombs, they're all for freedom, liberty, and democracy? I mean, it's we got the amount of people that were murdered in Iraq, the innocence, of these so-called smart bombs, being dropped. The human cost was enormous. So do we blame democracy for that? I don't. These are these are important questions, I think, to ask, because they involve sort of moralities and what it means and what type of society we want to be living in. But if you're going to judge others, then self-reflect those questions upon your own as well.
Absolutely. Apologies for the shifting of the images, but I wanted to stop on some of the images. So I've moved us away from the automatic thing, because I think the materiality of the work is really important and quite difficult to disentangle as you're in front of the work. And I wondered whether it be, I mean, is this the body of work you were referring to?
Yeah, so this is about this is a holy mountain of well, it's the Himalayan mountains. This is called water towers, and so they're called the Himalayan mountains are called the water towers of China because they feed the two main rivers there, and of course that is the Tibetan region. So humanitarian issues aside, geopolitically, if that area is occupied by a foreign power, they have control over the rivers. Control over the rivers is obviously a strangulation of that civilization. So often the lifeblood of it are the rivers. But of course, China is also damming these rivers, hundreds of like hydroelectric power stations, but they can also shut the water off. And so those downstream from these rivers that are reliant on it, they have a lot of political leverage over. In this painting, the lightning bolt in the top left is actually a mirror of the river systems themselves, suggesting the hydroelectricity. So what I often do in my recent landscape paintings is that I have what I think of as a kind of divine space at the top, and then a kind of materialized holy landscape, and then the harnessing of the landscape. And then in other paintings, there's usually a symbol of a human individual, perhaps a house or a nail house or something,
Or a boat.
That would suggest, a human abode. In this one, this is a string of pearls, and it's a map of China's future ports that they are collaborating with these different nations. And they are providing a lot of infrastructure loans in order to create some of these ports. Now, a US, I believe, military contractor was the one that termed it as the string of pearls. And it was a way for them to use and to define this action that China is undertaking as a form of military might. And so there's a battle of words and a battle of like definition as to what these actions actually represent. But the sphere of influence there is actually India in that region. So it would be very difficult for China to actually dominate, if you like, those sea lanes. But they are sort of forming canals or trying to form a canal through Thailand, for example, to circumvent the Strait of Malacca. Which is the bottom right area, and the line that's going through that bottom right area towards China is a oil tanker route, and obviously every civilization at the moment requires oil that is obviously in collaboration, mostly controlled by the US and Saudi Arabia or the Middle East. And so, at any given moment, they can strangle, those either sea lanes by blocking it with warships, with whatever reason they may well choose. Maybe there's some sort of a clash, of a patrol boat or something with a warship, etc. So that would then obviously cause enormous economic damage, on China. And so they've created these alternative trade routes, which is part of the Belt and Road Initiative, otherwise known as the reignition of the Silk Roads. The South China Sea is the sea route around there is worth about $7 trillion a year, has oil and gas, and that's where they've been building these artificial islands that I include in my still life paintings. So here you see on the bottom left is actually the original opium boat, or rather the gunboat called Nemesis that was sent by the British at the behest of the East India Trade Company, which was the most powerful and still is historically the largest company in the world in terms of how much money they controlled. And they were involved in colonization, slavery, and militarized trade routes, etc., and opium trading. So they essentially Britain agreed to become the first narco state in history. The first global drug dealer. And was pushing it, onto China and forcing them to buy. And so it weakened China enormously, leading to, of course, the loss of Hong Kong from where my parents are from, and loops back to the early collage work, in which at the time I didn't understand why I was compelled or profoundly compelled to make that particular work, but I knew it was really important to me. And then slowly over the years, I learned about the history that was otherwise denied to me.
The relationship to histories is crucial in understanding and decoding, I think, these paintings. But perhaps there's other versions of understanding the paintings that might not require it. How do you think that paintings hold knowledge in this sense? It's such a pleasure to be talking to you about the paintings, because you hold so much of the knowledge and can decode it for us in that sense. But what of an audience that comes without prior knowledge? Do they? How does art generally hold knowledge, embed knowledge, and then release that knowledge, or provoke its release in some way?
So from I suppose, an initial viewing of the work, I like to create these works that you have an initial impression of. So maybe it's of a conventional painting. As you come up closer to it, you come to understand that it's made through these technological and technical processes that are to be deciphered in formal terms, in a way. It's like,
could you do it for it? Could you decode that a little bit? Because it's tantalizing seeing this painting. I can figure out some of it, not all of it.
So the background of the paintings are often of the stock listings of the Financial Times. I only use the numbers. So they're metaphorically symbolizing the digital space that we all exist in, these flows of information, that we exist within. And wherever, these trillions are moving in an instant around the world, carves a kind of virtual landscape. And to me, this is the techno sublime. And so the sublime becomes an important component in the work that's, I would say, fairly familiar in the West in terms of a visual rhetoric, epic landscapes, and wide, vistas, usually small figures to accentuate the hugeness, the vastness. But then the way that I construct the landscapes is with this information. I've substituted, paint for information as pigment and brush for technology. But of course, I do use paint, but in unorthodox ways. And going back to what I was saying originally, which is to create these kind of spaces that you're invited to break down. And through breaking it down into the way how it's made, then you start to unweave as you learn more about the narratives. So a little bit like when meeting someone for the first time, you can't be expected to, understand who they are immediately. You learn through conversations, and you yourself are interacting or interfacing with many of these signs, a little bit like maybe our desktop computer with its icons and so on. Each of these can be broken down into kind of apps, if you like, and what they unfold is for you to explore and to weave together, or to figure out what that narrative, is. that is intrinsically part of the work.
That's really intriguing, because last week we were speaking to Sarah Jaffrey about, she was talking specifically about the drawing room at the British Museum and how that provided the opportunity for artists who were redrawing those drawings to have conversations with artists who may or may not be with us anymore, certainly won't be in the room. And the idea that you might have a conversation with the work, and that offers an opportunity to in a sense have a conversation with the history of the work, but also with the artist that created it in some sort of, unspoken way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's society and civilization. There's a feedback loop with
Yeah.
meaning. Things that used to be understood in a particular way is now understood in a different way.
Mm.
It's like, now there's a call for the British Museum, for example, to actually acknowledge that it is a den of stolen works, from around the world. That's not to mean that each of those works don't still represent an incredibly beautiful artifact of a fragment of a civilization from which our memory, like a memory cell, of our humanity, but it's so important to also acknowledge that they actually belong elsewhere and that they were stolen through conquest, in many respects. That's an important part of, our humanity and civilization to acknowledge. It's history, and so that probably wasn't understood at the beginning, but now we are wanting more of that way of understanding our world, and whether you agree with it or not, it is a fact that was part of its history and important to acknowledge, despite it being a long time ago, in quotes, which is often a apologist's way of denying the reality of history.
When we spoke on, and for those audience members who weren't here when I mentioned it earlier, Gordon and I had a brief chat last week, and one of the things we discovered about each other, I guess, is that for both of us, our parents were not born in the UK, and I was speaking a little bit about in relation to what that meant for them in terms of belonging or not belonging. And I'm wondering, as you're speaking, you spoke a little bit about discovering the politics in your work as beyond perhaps your time at CSM, and how the position of the person who is not born in Hong Kong but is talking about Hong Kong and has a historic relation to Hong Kong really makes that dynamic very complex, because in a sense you have a perspective from multiple sides, from multiple points of view.
Yeah. So, I was born in this country, and I remember going through school and thinking that I was white, for a long time, until I started experiencing racism. And then, in getting into fights and stuff at school because of bullying.
Yeah.
And, I grew up during the Brixton riots, and, not knowing what that meant really at the time. And, we had like gangs such as National Front, Combat 18, roaming the streets, scrawling, graffiti, against people like myself, just because I look different, to the majority of the nation. So obviously my family my parents and my family have, in some ways conveyed to me how Hong Kong is also my home, and it's always a place that they've always wanted to return to, and they do. They're now retired there after making a success, here in the UK. So I've always had that sort of in-between state. I have never really lived in Hong Kong. I visited Hong Kong, but I do think of it as a kind of home as well. It's where my ancestral roots are. My parents are indigenous to Hong Kong, and they come from villages in the New Territory, some of the oldest, parts of Hong Kong. One of them being a history trail place, my mother's side. And my father's village can trace me back to being 27th generation. So very long-standing roots of identity, that. But of course, I've lived in London for all of my life, and so I have a deep connection here as well. But I also understand, that at any time, if a fascistic government took power here, I'd be one of the first in line to be kicked out or targeted for political weaponization.
Yeah.
And this is something I think that a lot of white people wouldn't understand. That we are, not necessarily considered, a citizen of this nation, dependent on the dominant political narrative, through which our leaders are projecting. And that leads on to what has been happening with COVID-19 and the pandemic, because President Trump, decided to call it China virus. And this type of dangerous fascistic statement to define, a virus as being Chinese, or a nation itself, is something that the World Health Organization itself said that they mustn't do, because we have seen historically what happens, when you define a race. So, for example, how the Jews were defined, as a virus or as rats, and so on, by the Nazi regime, and what that led to. These are really important sort of and dangerous moments, and the fact that it was the most powerful man in the highest office, of the most powerful nation in the world, stating this. And what was frightening was the way how the media were relatively silent about it. They ignored his phrase most of the time, but they gave him the platform to persistently, say that without much pushback at all, despite the spike in Asian crimes against Asians, at the time. And this bled through into the UK as well. There were some politicians calling it China virus at the time as well, or Wuhan virus, or maybe one of the funnier ones would be Kung flu, But the danger of this type of rhetoric is obvious to anyone that just simply, looks at some recent history.
The history embedded in the works is complex and multiple, and often dealing with things that are incredibly painful. And yet, I often see in the paintings a sense of perhaps the mystical, perhaps the magical, and there is some foreboding, and some of them are darker than others, I think. But I'm reading some hope in some of these paintings. Do you think that there's?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Well, there's always hope,
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, I guess, and even in the darkest times of my life, there was always a glimmer of hope, and also in contemporary art, we're afraid of the word beauty. It's seen as unserious, and I disagree. I think it's an incredibly important part of the human experience. It's intrinsically part of our DNA, to experience, beauty and to find elation. It's our human condition. It's part of our soul, if you like. And all of these aspects, I want to somehow convey in my work, that this humanity that we're all part of in every aspect, and to look deep into the abyss of, what we have done in the name of great civilizations, as a way to understand our histories in a whole way that isn't just a glorified version, one in which we are able to dismantle, the narratives that are given to us in order for us to potentially rebuild it in a better way, in a way that we want, a way that we feel that we can participate in, to empower ourselves, to be able to contribute to those narratives and feel that we have an effect, and we can only do that by understanding the stories that are, given to us. And art has a role, I think, in doing that. It's an incredibly important conduit, for understanding our human experience, humanity, to question the who, the what, and the why, am I? And where do we want this world to go? I mean, it's just it just feels profoundly important, to think about these sorts of things, and there's extreme excitement, as well about the types of revolutions, that we're undergoing technologically, politically, and now recently we're on the cusp of a new monetary system with cryptocurrency, decentralized monetary system, etc. And what that will enable, us as a people, to do, that will take, some power away, hopefully, from the centralized banking system that has led us to these economic collapses that we've been experiencing, and the greatest transfer of wealth into the hands of the few. So, all of these are, I think, very important things.
Something's just hit me, and it's and we've been talking about technology quite a lot, and I want to talk about technology in relation to science, and specifically in relation to time, or the possibility of time travel in the works, because it seems to me that the relationship that your works have to time is really important, both in terms of historic time, but also in terms of sort of an arcane time, the mountains that have been there for millennia, or in terms of future time, and there's this sort of because time at once makes things current, it brings history to the present, but it also makes everything equivalent or irrelevant beyond a certain point, in across infinite time and infinite space, and it seems really interesting to me that device is really at work here, and the paintings have their own material sense of time, and the time taken to produce, the time embedded within the work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's for example, the use of sand in my work. Is a metaphor for how everything turns to sand. And I often think of that Shelley's poem Ozymandias. In which it's a poem about looking at a great visage, in the desert, and how what is it? Oh, ye mighty despair! It's this kind of fragment, of a gigantic statue, that suggests that a great civilization had built this, and yet that civilization crumbled into sand. So there's this kind of existential sort of implication. And it's the same as when you're standing on the edge looking at a great vista. The experience of the sublime is an existential experience, because you yourself, your individuality, is brought and exploded into this vastness. You question, what does it mean to exist in this spark of a moment of existence? So in those moments, you can stand in awe and beauty, but also ask yourself, well, what do I want to do with my life? It's on this planet so brief. What is the meaning? What is the purpose of all of this? And sometimes it's epic absurdity. It's like why are we standing facing climate change? Why are we still warring? All of these large questions, and the only way to come to understand those is to look at the very structures of our existence, the types of societies and civilizations that we built, the types of stories and narratives that we have used to weave those structures together, those into becoming institutions that then sort of come to determine, the life that we lead. And only then can we begin to come to understand a way to change it. And we each, it's not necessarily the case that any one of us can do it, but collectively, in the same way that now we are requesting, from our institutions that they acknowledge, where, artifacts have come from, didn't exist before. This is a gradual, process of a kind of enlightenment, and so I find all of that. All facets of our life, fascinating for that reason. It's part of who we are. From being from the self-centered, internal, inner, spiritual aspect of ourselves, exploded all the way through to how that is projected by our civilizations and the cultures and the societies and all of these invisible infrastructure that we have collectively built.
Well, then I'm going to bring two other ideas of time to this, perhaps a little mischievously, and that is one, the time cheater that is the artist that leaves works beyond their lifespan, and the romantic, the ability that has to invoke the problematic romantic figure of the artist, and the time that's so expansive that, and I don't see this as negative actually, that it renders you with the only answer possible is, so what? Or actually, I amount to nothing. It's a nihilistic response to time, which I don't necessarily see as negative. I can see that as the beginning of a possible, given the so what, you can therefore make a move. But I don't know what, I'm not even asking questions, I'm just throwing something at you there. Catching
Yeah.
you.
No, I think, I mean, satisfying my ego is, is sometimes a happy experience, but no, I think that most artists that I'm interested, I guess I'm interested in, they're interested in something beyond themselves, and that is the question, and that is usually the artists that I'm interested in are those that are wondering about the larger questions of life, and that means looking beyond yourself into the larger aspects of what our world means, and that means taking interest in lots of histories, and for me, my ancestral roots, as well as the cultures that I live within as well. So yeah, I mean, time crosses many interlaced thresholds of different plateaus of histories and identities, philosophies, psychologies, all the way through to geopolitics. It's all about the tapestry of our humanity.
That's a beautiful, epic statement on which to perhaps invite our audience to start asking questions. So I'm going to carry on talking to Gordon, but I know you've got hundreds of questions. Don't be shy, audience. Start typing them in the chat and we'll start bringing them in. Mita will be throwing questions at us as they emerge. But one thing that I did say we might talk about, which is slightly taking us to a more sort of pragmatic place, but I think it does relate in terms of money and art, and that is, you spoke about having to having to rearrange the studio in light of the current situation. And I just wondered what, well, first of all, what the Gordon Cheung studio is like, how that works, and secondly, what the current environment means for that mode of making. Has it an effect? Does it shift the way you make? Does it need to? Should it?
So I had my last solo exhibition in January, and lockdown occurred during the last week, I think. So I was very lucky to have just avoided that side of things. And the show went really well, which is, there was lots of reviews, and then during lockdown, we didn't really know how long it was going to last for. So, you had to readapt. And I'd already been thinking about restructuring my studio anyway. Plus, I was meant to be moving studios.
Right.
And so there was a lot of organizing to do anyway. And that extended through into restructuring the way how the studio might function in the future, becoming possibly more of a hub. And I have a few assistants, that help me make my work, and I'll be able to maybe travel elsewhere to do archive research based works, such as I've been applying for a residency at Jinzhezhen in China, because I'm making a new body of porcelain works, and Jinzhezhen being the so-called capital of porcelain in China. And this is rooted in my interest in the I suppose the trade routes being a tie between the different empires and civilizations, and so thinking ahead in that way, and also just getting a proper inventory of all of my works, really kind of like stuff that should have been done many years ago, but taking this opportunity to actually do that. And it's taken almost 9 months, I guess, or 10 months to sort through and get done. And just planning ahead as well. So, but before I got to that was I felt it was really important because I started selling some prints online and being part of the artist support pledge. And what was really great about that was the way how the community came together in order to support each other in this time of crisis. There was this incredible generous spirit, about obviously sharing your work, but also having other people sort of, collect it, by other artists and so on, because it was so affordable. It was like, it was under £200 for a work of art, and for every, I think, five or that you sell, you would pledge to buy one at £200 as well. And it's a beautiful idea, and I think it's still ongoing, it's still happening, and these are new cultures, if you like, for how the art world, certainly amongst artists that aren't necessarily represented by a commercial gallery, are going to probably continue to function, and be. So I think I think it's fantastic, the way how, because we often as artists live, hand to mouth, and we have other jobs that in order to fund, our passion, which is making art, and to have jobs taken away, without it being your fault, is going to cause an enormous strain. And I think artists understood this and came together to support each other.
I mean, many of our students are actively experiencing this with, jobs on the side to help them get through their education, and the majority of those jobs have just vanished, and it's been very brutal. I mean, my heart sings when you call the art world the community. It's the first time I've heard a group of artists called a community in that sense, and I think new imaginings of what a community can be around that, I think, are really important. That it doesn't simply become a sort of an economic structure, but rather something that's much more nourishing than that.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's the grassroots of culture, and yeah. But we have a system in which obviously, few get selected by the hierarchy that we exist in. So, and then they get to, ride through history.
There are loads of questions coming in. I'm keen to get going on them because we're not going to get through. The first one's a nice, easy one. Well, perhaps not so. Perhaps the answer isn't so easy, but me reading it out is nice and easy. From Sophie, how do I become your assistant?
What? Really?
Yes.
Oh, well, email me, and through my website or on Instagram, and someone will get back to you.
There you go, Sophie. You heard it here first. You're going to be inundated, you realize now, Gordon, don't you? Okay, next question. I find this idea of the sublime as a soft power and the way you play with its legacy in your work very interesting. I was wondering whether you consider its very temporarily specific visual rhetoric to be something that should be consigned to the past and remain a fixed thing to play with, or whether there's a subversive potential salvation in rethinking our relationship to its visual canon, perhaps in putting forth alternative, non-hegemonic versions of it. Can we save the sublime?
Yeah, I mean, the sublime is so much still part of our visual experience, I think, and history. So there's a sort of, I guess, a bedrock of understanding what it is, but in revisiting it and looking at it from our timeline and our understanding of the world and of its history, it's a feedback loop. You then also feed into a new understanding of it. It's not that we need to leave any of what it used to mean during its time, but to understand that actually over time it has been changing. It's entered all sorts of different mediums as well. Photography, cinema, and so on. It's part of the lexicon of our cultural understanding. It may shift in terms of depending on the nation that you're interpreting. The sublime. But again, that's another feedback loop. It will come to affect that narrative as well. So whether there is a subversive potential salvation, absolutely. It's entirely up to you and whether you can convince the collective or whether there's a momentum in being able to use that history and understanding for relevant contemporary modern day purposes that people feel has meaning, to their existence. Whether that's rearguard action or whether that is a kind of avant-garde is entirely up to, I guess, culture. And
I guess who's sublime is always the question I would ask. Who's sublime is the question I would always ask.
No, exactly. Yeah, no, exactly. Who's sublime? It's like whose history, who's writing it. That's what I mean by these fixed points of history.
Yeah.
It's like we need to, shake it up. And I use an algorithm as a direct way of metaphorically visiting this idea. This algorithm, open source, by Kim Asendorf, called pixel sorting, that basically reorganizes the pixels. It doesn't destroy, erase, or copy over, but just reorganizes it into what I call a new order. And this idea of repetitions of histories or histories that rhyme, but the glitch or the blur, as in what Richter does, Gerhard Richter, the German painter, it's a way, his history paintings are a way of, when they're blurred, they're a way of suggesting a timeline in flux. So therefore you question, the fixed point of the image. You're invited to question the alternative, timelines, of that history.
There's a question a delicious question coming up now from Millie. You spoke about the sublime and how it presents us with questions about what we're doing or what we want to do with our lives. Have you found an answer to these questions? Are your paintings part of the answer? And do you think that it's some sort of collective growth of knowledge around this, or is it very personal? Is it your specific discovery of the answer, or is it a collective understanding of the answer? And in what way can the paintings be a part of this?
Well, I personally think that, or certainly with my experience of making art, it always has to begin from a personal place. So for example, my identity that as an in between a person between British and Chinese in a globalized space where perceptions of time and space are in a constant state of flux because of the technological revolutions of the internet and so on. But and through just that description, you're already moving from the personal into the wider world. So it's again, I keep coming back to this idea of a feedback loop, but there isn't necessarily a fixed goal of understanding neither, because I don't know. It's a work in progress, if you like. It's a work in progress to understand life while experiencing it at the same time. And you do that by moving in a direction that you are compelled to do. And you may well not know or completely understand why you're moving in that direction, but it's important to move, and to find. And in a way, it's a cliche to say, but the destination is the journey itself.
Well, then let's talk about journeys. I'm going to. No, I've done that one. I've done Liam. Okay, you spoke about the importance of knowledge about our histories and how we've got to where we are in order to mold our future. What are your thoughts on the level of the individual exploring him, herself, and taking a more sort of experiential or spiritually connected journey rather than a sort of intellectual knowledge, and the benefits that society that could arise from this? So, if we're not using historic knowledge, if we're using a sort of self-knowledge or a spiritual knowledge, what might that afford our understanding of society?
Goodness me.
Good question.
Your students are pretty hardcore, It's great. You're speaking a lot about the importance. Can you rephrase that question for me, actually? That's what are your thoughts on that?
So what I'm going to say is, I think what we're getting at here is that that there are different forms of knowledge that are being posited, and one of them would be a sort of an academic or factual knowledge, a historic knowledge, and the other might be a sort of self knowledge that might depend more on a sort of spiritual knowledge.
Yeah.
Those are traditions potentially. How might they, shift our understanding of society or the world?
Sure. I mean, a lot of art making is a kind of search and exploration, within oneself. And there are spiritual dimensions, for want of a better word, I guess, through that exploration. The nuances of your thoughts about how you are going to materialize this in an act of art making, in the physical. So the translation between your inner self into the physical realm, whatever medium it is that you're using, the most powerful forms of art, that, perhaps in history, are those that are drenched in a humanity, that we feel is an important signifier of who we are or what we represent in society and civilization. So it's incredibly important, those human experiences, but the power of how you are able to convey that through the multitudes of human experiences that you may choose to draw from, is, it's up to society to determine whether it's important or not, and for it to change, for it to transform, and it happens, and it happens. It can happen because you're part of a collective, for sure. So you draw upon all sorts of different knowledge bases, whether that is an external, source, such as a philosophical book or something, or simply because you like to depict, I don't know, a breath on a window or something. It's something as something that can be incredibly poetic. So many bases of knowledge and so many pathways to create art that can benefit society. But most important is that you discover and find what compels you to make the profound decision to make art in the first place. You know, something drew you to this place, you know, to make art. And I don't think it's to do with money, because it's probably one of the worst decisions that you could possibly make if you do that. But there's something else more meaningful, you know, and that is what is sometimes a journey of discovery within oneself. You know that this is what's important to you, and you're constantly finding a way to discover it and to manifest it physically.
There are two questions now that have come through that I think are linked, one from Christopher and one from Mita. And I'll read out Mita's. Do you feel you can use specific cultural references in your work without having to explain or internationalize it for your audience? To what extent do you feel you have to decode those references within the work? And Christopher's question was in relation to that, but also thinking about the multiple cultural references that are coming through in the work, that are not simply coming from either a British perspective or a Chinese perspective or an American, but actually in a number of different.
I'm not entirely sure what that question. Could you rephrase that again?
Well, I think what Mita is asking is, do you feel a duty in those cultural references to explain it for the audience? Does the audience need to know where that cultural reference is coming from and why, or is there a sense in which things coexist?
I think there's a myth in thinking that any artwork, you know, can immediately divulge all of its meanings and so on. You know, we as students, you know, have learned so much by observing other art and reading, talking, and so on. This builds up a knowledge base of a way of perceiving, you know, art and a way of interpreting. You've created these tools to understand.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I like to, when I go to see a show and stuff, to not read the press release straight away. And I go in there, and also combined with like something I used to do when I do the group crits, which is I would make the student that's presenting their work not speak, but someone else would have to pretend as if they made it themselves.
Right.
And then everybody would ask questions to this person, you know, about the artwork. And so the benefit of that is that the artist would actually learn about what others are actually thinking, what this work means. And also a lot of people feel much more comfortable asking questions as well, knowing full well that it'll be their turn. The point of that story is that you try to imagine what that artist is trying to do from their point of view. You know, you occupy their space as much as you can. And then you have this kind of conversation, as we were talking about, you know, and you're interfacing with all of these signs, you know, whether it's a sculptural form, a film, or a painting, photography, you know, and so on. You bring your own. It's the feedback loop again, you know, of understanding, and so I think that yeah, it's a continual process of learning and understanding that you yourself take a proactive approach as to how you find the knowledge to understand the work, you know, and not to deny your interpretation as well, which is completely valid, you know. And quite often, sometimes I when I really viscerally hate an artwork, which doesn't happen so often anymore now, but years later I would come to love it. You know, it's just like it had touched an emotional raw nerve that was something really important, you know. And so it can take years to come to understand something, to build a relationship, if you like, a relationship of understanding, to build up some knowledge. It comes back to like the way how we interact with people.
Yeah.
It's just like it's impossible to know why, you know, where you bought your necklace from, where you bought your clothes from, why you growing your beard, and so on. It's something that you come to understand over time, and over time it enriches your understanding, of that person. And in the same way, art can be like that. Great art is something that you feel compelled to go back to again and again and again, and you learn something new, not only about the art but about yourself as well.
I think in my instance, knowing where I got my clothes from, ASOS and the necklace, is going to cheapen your understanding of me. But I'm fascinated by what you're saying there. And there's a really sort of urgent question that's come through from Lou. Hello, thank you for this lecture, so inspiring. Recently, I've been interested in these themes of honesty and disclosure regarding the society that she lives in. In a way, she wanted to do work that exposes the rise of the far right and its infiltration into various areas of soft power, e.g. yoga studios, YouTube videos, conspiracy theories. However, she's worried that in some ways, she's preaching to the converted in the work, but perhaps more worryingly, the other option is that she's providing a platform for these movements. And her question is it best to suffocate or to expose? So when you're dealing with problematic histories, are you challenging them, or are you simply providing a space in which those problematic histories replicate themselves and become more real?
Wow.
They're hard questions today.
I mean, that's fantastic that you're pursuing that line of investigation, and like I just said, in a way, is to constantly also find the roots of why you are compelled to profoundly, spend and invest your time and energy into expressing these ideas, will lead you in the right direction. So I wouldn't worry about preaching to the converted. Presumably we all do, because that's the circle of people that are going to be interested in your work. So if you wanted to find a way of reaching out, or if that was to become part of your work, that you're going to actually push your work into a place that is uncomfortable, because there will therefore then be conflict, with people that are going to disagree. That is a choice for you to make. Whether you feel profoundly the profound reason, to do that, because you feel that that's the best way to elevate and to create a platform to expose these kind of a subculture, I guess, of within places that we might not think would have such far right sensibilities. But I guess I wouldn't worry about this idea of preaching to an echo chamber. It's and that you're aware of it will probably mean that you will be able to find a way out of it. So I think it's not something that you need to concern yourself, other than to make as great art as you can.
Thank you. So Grace has asked a number of questions. I'm going to try and go to the one that I think is perhaps one that we haven't had a chance to answer yet. And that is, she wants you to unpack the relationship to beauty in your work, and your view on beauty. Because in some ways, beauty is quite a problematic term, and a term that can also be considered politically in all sorts of ways. How would you address that question of beauty? In the talk.
Maybe beauty is unfairly connected to another word, which isn't so welcomed in contemporary art, which is decorative, and I guess it's kind of.
I would always talk in praise of the decorative, though. I'm massively.
I love the decorative and the crafts and so on. You know, it's a ridiculous hierarchy that we possibly have in contemporary art. You know, and you know, maybe we can blame someone like Greenberg, Clement Greenberg, you know, for this type of hardening of a kind of hierarchy of high art to kitsch. You know, and it's a kind of a power system of aesthetics. And what unfortunately that does is that it dismisses many of the human experiences that are captured in such forms of art. And like I said before, beauty is an important part of the human condition. Who doesn't like beauty? You know, just because it's something that we like, it doesn't make it frivolous. You know, in fact, it can be incredibly deep. You know, it's such a important aspect of living and of being.
But that might be precisely the problem with beauty, that the decorative in its relationship to excess, the decorative is also that which is not required. It's the extra.
That's one definition of beauty, this idea of excess. You know?
Well, no, I mean the decorative, not beauty. I think beauty is often played out through a notion of taste and a very particular version of taste as something else. And so it's very, you know, beauty is culturally often prescribed and then becomes very partial. It's that version of beauty, that and can often be used as a way of creating that hierarchy. I know beauty, therefore I know kitsch. And so that then becomes very difficult to.
Exactly, it's a kind of artificial language, right? So it's a language of hierarchy, you know, and it's a way of defining whether you have taste or not, and a kind of snobbery, aesthetic snobbery. And whereas I don't care for it that much, you know, and if something triggers such a experience in me that's so positive, why wouldn't I be, you know, lapping that up, you know, and absorbing it into myself, you know, into my well-being? Why wouldn't I do that? You know, it's hard enough to find inspiration, you know, and motivation, you know, to make art. And if that is something that triggers such a positive feeling in myself, then why would I not fold that into my experience of making art as well? You know, these are the sorts of drives and triggers, you know, that allows, you know, artists to feel that they can stay, you know, past midnight in the studio because they're making something incredibly beautiful and profound and so on. You know, it's it drives us, you know, it moves us, and it expands our mind, you know, into these fantastic dimensions. So this power system of aesthetic definitions and so on, these kind of, you know, determined by intellectuals and whoever, I don't know whether you need to obey them other than because it's part of the culture that you, or the tribe that you want to be part of, you know, that you want to wear the same uniform, you know, the same intellectual uniform as a certain circle of, you know, of a culture, of an intellectual or a group of artists or so on. So, but I always say, do what you feel is most, you know, compellingly important to you.
So there's, I'm not going to have time to get to all the questions. It's already 7:02, but there's two teeny questions that I just want to throw in there just before we finish, if that's all right, Gordon. And that is, there's a question about, we're coming down to something sort of more prosaic now and more sort of nuts and bolts. How do you know when something's finished? And this minute I asked that question, I know it's a complicated one to answer. And the second one is, a very practical question about the interested in the material and the physical processes that you use. Can you explain how you paint? The studio pictures imply that you need to protect yourself from fumes. Do you use varnishes, spray paints? Do you rely heavily on design in advance, or does it develop more organically? Something about it's a very practical in the studio. You've given us the vision of the art studio till 12 o'clock at night. What are you doing in that studio, and when do you know it's finished? When do you go?
So the studio is also perhaps my office and the computer as well. And of course the ideas start somewhere at the back of your mind, whatever it is, yeah. An accumulation of like inspiration and a general framework of like where I want the work to be heading towards. And finally all those dots and ideas, they start joining up into something that then I feel physically I'll need to actually make this now. And that begins on the computer, where I've accumulated an enormous amount of images from Google and so on that I call a virtual palette. From there, I photo collage together images with the ideas that I'm thinking about in my head. And then in the studio, I've already pre-prepared, or my assistants have pre-prepared stock listings on sheets of that I can collage together. Mm. They are specially varnished to allow me to inkjet print onto. And then at home, I have a large printer that then I print the image that I've constructed on Photoshop, and I will then jigsaw them back together in the studio. Then the paint and all these different techniques sort of go into it: the sand, the ink, the staining, the spray painting, and the collaging of the paint and so on. So, but quite often at the Photoshop stage, I will nowadays deliberately leave a difficult area, in the image itself. Yeah. The reason for that is because then in the studio, I have something unpredictable to deal with. And in that space of unpredictability, I'm able to usually create a new language. And in that new language, sometimes that can spawn a new body of work, or a new idea, a new strain of work. So it's always a constant sort of process of like bringing something to fruition through all of the techniques and processes that I've built in the studio. And of course that means adapting the studio to spray painting. I'll have like curtains of plastic down, and of course I'm wearing a gas mask as well, which has become very useful, or did become very useful during COVID.
And then the final question, the question of endings at the end of this talk. Oh, yeah. Perhaps that's appropriate. When do you know it's finished? And then we will know that this is finished, perhaps.
Well, an artwork is in a way one continuous lifetime, timeline. But of course, there are steps, in that stream that is continuous and changing. An artwork is finished when I don't feel I can do any more to it. I mean, it's kind of as honest an answer I can give, in that way. It's like, and sometimes a deadline will expedite that decision as well. Occasionally, a artwork, when I look back, I realize I need to do more to it. But at the time, it was finished, but because I've changed, my mindset has altered. I've learned now about what I've created, because I don't always know exactly why and what it is that I've created. And so there's again this kind of conversation between me and the work as well. And it's constantly adjusting, it's constantly thinking about the future artworks as well, and sometimes it's this process of creating this internal culture in which you can feel inspired through the processes and the research that you're undertaking to ensure that you always have something that you are working towards. And that is a process of self-actualization and understanding of oneself through the making of your art, and obviously from looking at other people's as well. So it never ends.
Thank you so much indeed. There are more questions, but we are going to have to bring it to an end now, I'm afraid. I'll keep all the questions, guys. We'll keep them and load them up. So the questions sit there as questions in relation to what we've heard today. thank you for agreeing to come and speak today, for agreeing to do it in this conversational mode. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And for showing us the work. It's great to bring in so many different questions and challenges to us as artists in what you spoke about. Thank you, audience, for asking such long and profound and difficult questions. That was very exciting. See you all again next week. Gordon, that was a joy. Thank you so much.
People are welcome to ask questions on my Instagram, and I'll try and answer. But very welcome to.
That's a real offer. Use it, guys. Thanks a lot. But only if you follow first. You must follow, and then you can ask questions. Thanks a lot. Good night, everyone. See you all next week. Brilliant as ever. Thank you. You're getting lots of love, lots of big thank yous and love hearts coming your way on the chat.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone.
Good night, everyone.